So I would like to ask all of you today, what comes to mind when you think of the Arctic? What do you think about? What image comes up when I talk about the poles? Because ever since I was young, I heard about this incredible area. I would imagine polar bears traversing across the ice that stretched for miles, or ambitious explorers looking for new routes, or harsh frozen landscapes that prompted adventure. This was the poles to me. In fact, if you were to Google the Arctic, this is what you would see. And it echoes a lot of the perceptions that many of us have regarding the poles, because it's a place that's very distant from where we are, a place we don't know much about. Now, as I grew up, this dialogue regarding the poles began to change. I heard less about how beautiful it was, and more about what issues were surrounding it. One issue in particular, climate change. And this dominated the public's perception on the Arctic. And it was all I heard about for a long time. And for that reason, I'm here to talk to you about a subject that's not as well known. Now, in the summer of 2016, I received the chance of a lifetime to go to the Eastern Canadian and Greenlandic Arctic with an organization called Students on Ice. And this organization helped bring young people to the poles so that they could become advocates for their protection. Needless to say, it worked on me. I went with 120 young people from all around the world, whether it was close by in Surrey or as far away as India and Malaysia. And along with me were 80 educators from any discipline you could think of. Whether it was art, history, science, it was all there. And these perspectives taught me so much about the poles, because it gave me a very diverse view on it and the issues that were surrounding it. And I brought those stories here with me today. Now, on my very first day, I was lucky enough to meet a few other people. In Ottawa, we got to meet Mr. Justin Trudeau. And I thought to myself, this is going to be amazing. This experience is going to change my view. But at the same time, I didn't know exactly how. I remember on our very first day on board, I would look outside the window, and I would be so completely fascinated by this view. Because this is what the Arctic was to me. Ice floes drifting past, the clouds that danced before us. I remember on our very first day, I was eating breakfast when suddenly our expedition leader came on. And he said, "Good morning, everyone. I'm not sure if you'd be interested, but there's something outside right in front of us that may capture your view." And there they were, 4 polar bears, a mother bear and her 2 cubs, a large male, and I sprinted to the very front of the ship. Because this is what I wanted to see. This is what the Arctic was to me. And I was completely swimming in joy. Because the polar bear is the poster child for the poles, or even the entire environmental movement. But at the same time, the Arctic is so much more than that. It embodies a culture, it embodies a people. It is a symbol of resilience, it is a diverse ecosystem. And this said something about how little I knew about the Arctic at the time. And throughout this expedition, I was about to learn a lot more. On our second day, we arrived in this place called Hebron. It is a small village on the northern coast of Labrador, established by Moravian missionaries in the 1830s. And I was so confused about why we were here. This wasn't the Arctic to me. Weren't we supposed to be really high out north? This was in Labrador. Wasn't it supposed to be really cold? Where were the glaciers? But when I arrived on shore, this is what I saw. And this, and this. It turns out in the 1950s, there were approximately 60 Inuit families living in this area. But one day, somebody came onto their shores. It was the government. And they said, "You are leaving." There was no consultation. This was a time of cultural assimilation. This was a time when Indigenous peoples weren't valued. And they took them away from their home, put their children into residential schools, relocated them far away from the place they were used to. In these residential schools, these young children were physically, mentally, emotionally, sexually abused. The place where the Inuit live is the basis for their entire way of life. When you take them away from that, you destroy it. Today, this is all that is left of Hebron, small scattered remains of a once vibrant village. Now, this is a friend of mine. Her name is Caitlin, and she was a staff member on board the expedition. And when she was there, I learned a really special story associated with her. It turns out that although she lives in Ontario, her family is from Hebron. In fact, in this picture, she's actually in her great-grandmother's house. And when she recounted her family's history, she couldn't help being so emotional about it, because she was looking at a life that could have been hers. She looked at a community that could have been hers. This house could have been her home. But that possibility was taken away from her. It was stolen from her. Now, as we recounted back towards the history of the Inuit, there was another story that came up by a friend of mine named Justin. Now, when Justin was a teen, he wanted nothing more than to have braces. He thought braces made you super cool, and he wanted them because everybody around him had braces, and he would get them too. So he went up to his mom, and he begged her for braces. And she said no. And he would beg again, and she would say no, and that happened over and over again until he gave up. But he never knew why he couldn't get his braces like everyone else. And it wasn't until a few years later that she finally decided to give an explanation. It turns out Justin's mother was a victim of the residential school system. And when she was there, dentistry services needed to be given out to their students. But just because they were necessary doesn't mean that they were regulated. So one day, one by one, these students would line up onto a school bus and head on off to the dentist. And he was paid for every tooth he removed, regardless if the procedure was necessary or not. So one by one, these kids would walk up and they would have a tooth removed. 2 or 3 if you were unlucky. And no anesthetic was given. Justin's mother was so traumatized by this experience, she wanted nothing more than to make sure Justin didn't have to go through it either. So she pulled him away from the dentist. She wanted to make sure she would never have to relive that. I hope you understand just how horribly these people were treated. I hadn't thought about this at all when I was headed to the Arctic. And as we recounted our time in Hebron, I looked back and I realized that many people around me were weeping, distraught. And I didn't really know why at the time, until I realized that many of these people were Inuit. Because something like this doesn't stop with one generation. It goes on and on and on. That pain moves on. And those that survived the residential school system looked for different ways to cope. They would turn to alcohol, substance abuse, violence, and those habits move on to their children, and on and on and on. So these people were looking at this issue, and they were realizing that it was a symbol for so many of the issues that they're living with today. Today, the Inuit suicide rates are 10 times the national average. Today, they're still not being consulted, or they're being spoken to, but they're not having any power in this position. Today, their way of life and their culture is being compromised by our actions. We need to look at this. We need to look at those mistakes we've made. We need to reconcile them. And we need to think of ways to stop this effect, because this isn't okay. I headed to the north expecting to see wildlife, to see these astounding sights, to be bombarded with all these beautiful things, to see evidence of climate change, and to become an advocate against it. And those are all true. But beyond those preconceptions was a complex web of lies, and so much there that I never even thought of. And this is something that I today want to do something about. Today I stand before you because I think this issue needs to be addressed. Today I stand before you because I want to share this story with an audience, especially as open-minded and curious as you all are. I stand here today because I had the opportunity to learn about them so I could do something about it. And I'm giving you that opportunity here today. What happens when you go to the polls? I'm standing here. That's my answer. My question for all of you is, what happens when you learn about them? Thank you.